Welcome to the CAREcast.
Welcome everybody to another CAREcast, and we are continuing in our new normal series, asking the big questions about what society is going to look like following the coronavirus pandemic. And in recent weeks, and possibly even months by now, in the ongoing saga of COVID-19, the focus has somewhat shifted more recently away from the daily death count and towards lifting and easing restrictions. And the lockdown that we all had to go through was exceptional and indiscriminate. But if you live in Preston, or you're watching from Leicester, or you are joining from other parts of Greater Manchester, in recent weeks you may have experienced a localised lockdown. And this, it seems, is going to be all part of the new normal. This is the whack-a-mole strategy that our beloved Prime Minister loves to herald. But what does this all mean? What are the issues? What are the concerns? What does track and trace involve? What about our data? How will this work? Is it possible that the government can actually come up with a workable way of bringing some kind of normality back to our lives? You may have been to the pub in recent weeks, and you may have had to give over your personal information, phone number, name, possibly your email as well. How do you feel about that? Is that something that will just carry on forevermore? Well, to discuss all of this, I'm delighted that on this week's CAREcast, we have once again Matt James and also Ian Berle as well. Gentlemen, welcome to the CAREcast.
It's great to be with you.
Wonderful. Matt, could you just tell our watchers, listeners, everyone on the podcast, what it is that you do and your particular interest in this subject matter?
Yeah, thanks, James. Well, I've got about 10 years experience, 10 or so plus years experience in bioethics and public policy. I currently work for kind of part of the week at St Mary's University, London, where I'm Associate Professor in Bioethics and Medical Law. The other part of my time is as a consultant to various think tanks, including CARE, on bioethics issues. And so I've particularly had an interest over the last 10 or so years about new emerging technologies and the ethical, social and policy implications surrounding those technologies.
Brilliant. And Ian, how about yourself? What is it that you have done throughout your career and are currently doing?
Well, I'm a retired clinical photographer and ran a large department, a medical illustration department at a large London teaching hospital. And in the mid-1980s, we all became concerned about consent to clinical photography and what it meant. Because at the time, nobody had ownership. We still don't have ownership in this country of our personal images. And I became increasingly concerned about how personal images were being used in hospitals by doctors who would like to use mobile phones when they came on board. When the cell phone became a camera, it became a huge risk in healthcare, and so on. And we developed policies that were de facto policies in hospitals to guide responsible practice. Anyhow, long story short, that led eventually to a need to get to grips with some bioethical questions. I wanted to have some arrows that I could fire from my own quiver. I couldn't just rely on our medical ethicists at the hospital to answer all manner of questions about consent to photography. And that led me to St Mary's, where I did the MA in bioethics in 2004 through to 5, or 3 to 5. And anyway, subsequently, and then consequently, I retired and I got more interested in the need for understanding privacy law and so on and so forth. This led to an MPhil where I discussed the issues of confidentiality and privacy with face recognition and personal identifiable images. And there's a book out there which we may draw on later. But the important thing is that images have become so abundant that we don't have any control. Facebook, you put an image up, selfies, all of these things. What happens to those images? And images today are data. And today we're talking about data and what that means. Is it in the past, data was just name and address, bank account details. It was just alphanumeric. But today we have images, and we have DNA, and we have biometrics, and so on and so forth. And we have become compulsorily visible. And that's where my concern is with the track and trace. Is this just another step towards a society where we do not have any control of how visible we are in terms of what goes on with the big data and the centralized activities that go on with government and Google or Apple or any of the other big tech behemoths that are out there? We don't know what's happening to our data. And this just seems to me another step in the direction where we lose control. It's put up as an idea of consent. The GDPR asks for consent to biometrics, but it doesn't say you must give consent to photography. It's the one area where face recognition technology is not required to give consent to. Other biometrics, it is fingerprints, eye scans, all that those sorts of things. And we are in this, we're in an area of unknowns. We're learning what the knowns are, but we also know where the unknowns are because of the consequences. Just look how often the government has moved the goalposts with coronavirus and how it's locked down and it's not locked down and it's locked down in one place and not in another. It's schools opening and oh no, it isn't. It's not schools opening. It's very much fly by the seat of your pants, so to speak, approach to this because we just don't know what the consequences are.
A fly by the seat of your pants approach is exactly the approach we like to take on this podcast as well. So I have some sympathy with the government on that. Let's just establish as we get into this discussion, and here's the treat for all of you watching and listening, in that I get the slight feeling that perhaps, Matt, you're not quite as suspicious about the use of biometrics and digital technology to create this brave new world of allowing people to move around and have their freedom. Am I right?
Certainly for the purpose of debate this morning, rather, I'm quite open to discuss the relative benefits, mindful of also the disadvantages and the challenges that face. So I think there's a bit of a trade-off, but we'll see how much of a trade-off as the conversation proceeds.
Absolutely. It's a gloriously diplomatic answer that you've just given there, Matt, and it is my job in the course of this podcast to bring out the inner rage within you. That's going to be my task.
Okay.
Good.
I wanted to polarize it a little bit so that we've got some clear,
indeed, yes,
kind of what's the word I want? Some light between the two.
Absolutely. Well, they've been too collegiate on previous podcasts, Ian. So you've brought a bit of heat, which is great.
Yeah, I think my main concern is we know in China they have social credits, and are we heading in that direction, drip by drip? So that we're not, so it becomes a sort of passive acquiescence to a kind of social credit. We've talked about digital certificate.
What is a social credit? What does that refer to?
Well, in China, if you're not critical of the government, and you stay out of trouble, you are allowed the best schools. You might get to a better university. You might have access to better healthcare or where to live and so on. And China has become a bit of a petri dish for surveillance. The West is looking in on how China is surveilling their population, or how the Chinese government is surveilling their population. And it isn't comfortable. And it certainly would be counter to liberal democracies that we have in our part of the world.
It's a fascinating point, isn't it, Matt? That as you look around the world, you look at how nations have dealt with the issue of coronavirus. That there has been a huge state run and managed involvement in the lives of its citizens here in the West, the likes of which we've not seen since possibly the Second World War. Whereas in some other countries around the world, there's a greater degree of normality about that, would you say? A greater ease of the state being more involved in the lives of its citizens?
Yes, like New Zealand, for example, it springs to mind that they've actually not pursued any kind of real high, not even high tech, but any technological solutions for track and trace and monitoring of their citizens. They've kind of very much focused on manual tracing. And I think perhaps the evidence speaks for itself that New Zealand is kind of really kind of leading the way in an effective strategy for dealing with this. China, as Ian's already mentioned, has taken a very kind of more hands-on approach to things, a more pervasive approach to tackling the pandemic, where they've used QR codes, those kind of odd little kind of square logos made up of even littler squares that you can scan with your mobile phone, smart tags, otherwise known as, to indicate a citizen's health status, to control their movements, where they're allowed to go, where they're allowed to go on public transport and so forth. So very effective, but zero privacy in terms of the individual. And so I think that points to one of the keys to all of this. It's empowering citizens to prove their attributes about themselves without revealing their individual information. And I think it comes down to an issue between identification versus authorization, which I think underpins much of the privacy surveillance conversation. What are we actually looking for? Are we looking to identify people so they can gain access? Or is it a case of just authorization, that they're authorized to involve themselves in a particular act? And it's a nice distinction to make, somewhat more difficult to perhaps apply in practice. But discerning and identifying whether we're after authorization versus identification, I think, is a key question to ask ourselves.
Yeah. And I think, Matt, if we go for those two aspects, one would lead to a kind of apartheid. You would be, in terms of the identification, if you weren't identified, you might be seen as an outsider. You might be seen as somebody somebody who is against the public health of your neighbour. And in a way, it kind of it associates this sort of utilitarianism where you're seen to be causing harm.
Sure.
And if we take that idea that the freedom we have is only freedom where we don't cause someone else's harm. I mean, let's face it, that's why we have traffic lights. We stop at red lights, hopefully, so we don't go crashing into people who have access in the opposite direction. And so if we're not careful, if we're too authoritarian, we could find ourselves we consent to stop at red lights because we know it's good for us. However, if we are restricted in a way that upsets our own values, our own set of understanding of who we are as a person, and our own individuality, are we then seen as an outsider if we say, well, my right is greater than yours? And are we then talking about rights and whose rights? And I think we have a good example here of the way of the debate going on about schools returning. Children have parents. Parents need to work. How can you have children still at home if parents need to work and the economy needs to keep going? So you've got those tensions already beginning to emerge. And if we're not careful, this will just overflow into a health scenario where if you don't have something that that identifies you or authentic or authorizes you, you're then going to have restrictions placed on us or on you. And that will either be you won't be able to have access to, I don't know, the pub, the church, the swimming pool, or any of the other social, even workplaces. So where are we going to draw the line?
This is it's the great challenge, isn't it? Because if you just picking up on this idea of the tension that can be created if people stand on their rights. Think about face masks, for example. There is documented examples on social media of individuals who choose not to wear a face mask because they have read possibly scientific papers, or perhaps I'm giving them a bit too much credit. Possibly they have read on Twitter that there are scientific papers out there that question the effectiveness, the efficacy of face masks, and yet these clips tend to be members of the public who are wearing a face mask shouting abuse and criticizing and calling into question the honor of someone who's not. I haven't yet seen any social media evidence of it being the other way around, and so that sense of divide, that's already present in our society, isn't it, Matt? Like, the face mask thing is already causing this debate to take place of rights and what duty do I have towards the public health.
Sure, rights, responsibilities, duties, and so forth. It's interesting, isn't it? I know George Orwell's book 1984 often gets kind of bandied out around about this point in privacy and surveillance conversations, and obviously it was a satirical, a very powerful kind of protest novel against, at that point, totalitarianism and for what he believed was a call to arms for a more liberal society. And yet, actually, when you think about it, it would appear it was the very nature of our modern liberal society in which we live in today that seems to be feeding this spread of wanting to track, trace, and monitor our movements. And I suppose liberal societies, unlike totalitarian ones, are diverse. Sometimes accidentally, but sometimes intentionally. We want to be kind of diverse and embrace diversity. But actually, the flip side of that diversity is unfamiliarity. There's so many of us doing all of our different things, that there is diversity and there's unfamiliarity in that. So a diverse society is one which we could spend much of our time amongst strangers, and a fact that's compounded by our ability to travel places and to move around, and also different ethical attitudes, perspectives on life. So a basic observation that humans want to trust the unfamiliar less than the familiar in a time of kind of pandemic, where an awful lot it's almost like a crunch time, where everything is very unfamiliar around us. We want a certain degree of certainty, and we want to be able to trust. And indeed, with all applications of technology, many institutions are calling that anything that the government brings about in terms of technology and being introduced to track and trace must be to preserve that element of trust between governments and society. And yet it begins to be this trade-off of, well, actually, we trust more of what we are familiar with, but actually, in the name of a more liberal society, is it actually causing more unfamiliarity? And there's a great interplay of different factors here.
Yeah. And the other thing is that there's the issue of consent. And I happen to, for want of coining, for want of a phrase, we talk about explicit consent, but there is also passive consent. And passive consent isn't the same as acquiescence. Passive consent says, well, I guess I must. Whereas acquiescence is where you put your arm out for a blood test. You don't sign the thing, but the very act of putting your arm out for somebody for a phlebotomist to take blood from your arm is seen as consent or acquiescence. But passive consent is this sort of slow drift to a sort of a change in our attitude. It's a sort of, well, I can't, well, do I? And it's all that sort of kind of nonchalance sort of sets in. And I can't help thinking that we're moving towards a position certainly in healthcare where we're expected to give consent for how our data is used. Another example of this is the data that we are being asked to consent to for research purposes. And yet we have got to provide who we are. We've got to consent by giving the NHSX or whoever, NHS Digital, our permission to look at our records so that they can pass them on to Google others. And so there is some we're creating some very strange bedfellows here when it comes to consent and different types of consent. And the GDPR and the Data Protection Act 2018 provide some kind of legal framework, but they're showing up. It also demonstrates how inadequate they are as a result of Corona, and where consent is beginning to become a sort of a de facto approach, where you're kind of expected, if you don't give your consent, then you're seen as somebody who isn't, you're a bit like a leper. You shouldn't be around in society if you don't give your consent. There's that issue of, if you've got nothing to hide, why not? Well, it's not about nothing to hide. And it's going to polarize society, whether you have a faith or not. There are those in the, a typical example now is the anti-vaxxers. There are people who are Christians and other faith groups who are against the vaccine, and there are others who don't have any faith at all, sort of in the religious sense of the word. And they are, and we're gaining kind of partnerships with people who are anti this. So we become the anti, or whatever it is that we're against. And the sort of the spiritual aspect of this, and depending on your eschatology, creates all sorts of issues, certainly for Christians who take notice of end time scenarios. Sure. And this may be too soon to introduce this, but this is, if you like, the elephant in the room for Christians who are concerned about end time scenarios and so on. And it also provides a platform for conspiracy theories as well. And so again, we come back to these very strange, odd bedfellows that are being kind of brought together as a result of all this debate over track and trace.
So just to unpack a little bit of what you're saying there, Ian, because it does, all really good points that you're making. Surely then, I would tend to agree with the general feeling, I think, that's coming out through the literature and media reports, that some privacy infringement is going to be expected in a time like this and during a pandemic. That moving forward, though, we've got to demonstrate that benefit to public health to justify its deployment. So in order to introduce some of these track and trace technologies and procedures, the public benefit has got to really be clearly identified and articulated for people to get on board with it. Given that the starting point, I think, is that most will say, well, look, there's got to be a degree of, it clues in the title, track and trace. We've got to monitor where people are going and who they're mixing with. And that, therefore, is going to entail a degree of privacy infringement. But if the benefit of these technologies, if techniques, processes can be clearly articulated and we can see, then building that relationship of trust that I've highlighted, then most people will feel that they can buy into that. Also, with the understanding that this is for a definite period of time, as opposed to we can allow our data to be accessed for this or for the pandemic, but there's a cutoff point. Otherwise, we can see potentially down the line that data could be collected, that could be stored, and then once we're post-COVID, the thought that everyone is carrying in their minds the days that we can put COVID behind us, actually that data could still be used against us or for us by employers to track our health behaviours and so forth. So do you think that there is a level of expectation that some privacy infringement is part and parcel of the process moving forward? It's how we control that, or can you see a time when actually, or can you expect a time that actually privacy shouldn't be infringed in any shape or form?
No, I'm not against the idea that there will be a need for that privacy intrusion. It's the issue, though, of where the data is held and for how long. And the important thing here is that we have some very good examples of how good, if we take the model that is used in for research ethics, we know that if we sign up to shall we say, a health research project, it's not for our benefit, it's for the benefit of others. But we also know that there will be a complete anonymization. They'll use our data for the purpose that it's only required for. And then when that research is over and it's published and whatever it is, we know that data may be archived, but it won't be it won't be pseudo-anonymized, it will be anonymized. And if we adopt some of the best practice that is used in research and the ethics that are applied there, and the codes of practice and so on, and I'm talking codes of practice, but that need a legal framework, not just a de facto, well, you know, this is the policy, but there's no law backing it up. It's got to be a legal framework that provides that that safeguard. And certainly in the, you know, it wasn't too long ago that the government was defeated over the Snoopers Charter regarding certain surveillance law. And that was given a sunset clause, and it all disappeared in 2016. Now, the legal framework is there. There's also the Freedoms Act that we must use as a device for providing a framework for the data to be self-contained. And yes, it will be important, and maybe James is right, that we will need a digital certificate. But we mustn't ostracize those of us who don't have and have never had COVID. Or what are we going to be doing? We're going to be lining up not for a vaccine, but for an injection to give us the virus so we can get our own antibodies, which I suppose is a bit like a vaccine. Now, I'm being facetious, but the thing is, there's got to be a legal framework that underpins the security of the data, the way the data is used, and for the length of time the data is held.
I wonder on this if from a Christian point of view as well, in recent weeks and months, for example, there has been one example of an element of the coronavirus emergency legislation that had a sunset clause attached to it, that the government is already talking about extending beyond the time frame in which the coronavirus legislation ends, and that is the policy change which allows for a woman to take both abortion pills at home with all of the attached risks that involves. So that was supposed to be a temporary arrangement, but now the government's going to consult to make that a more permanent part of the future. Now, for some Christians, that'll be a prime example of why you can't trust what the government says. So it's all very well for the government to say, we'll store your data on track and trace for X amount of time. But Matt, just picking up on this trust issue, trust is a two-way thing, and for a lot of Christians,
Absolutely.
there is no trust in the government's words. Is it not the case that the government would have to have a fundamental transformation if it was ever to win that trust back? So why should we then trust the government with our data?
Well, absolutely. What's the old adage? Trust takes years to build, but seconds to destroy. So absolutely, it's a great kind of touchstone to refer to in these conversations, but a little bit more messy to actually see it in practice. I think all the more reason, without being trite, to pray for government, even if it's not necessarily the colour of government that we would naturally vote for, or indeed the colour of the government that we voted or thought we were voting in for some listeners. So all the more reason to pray for government. But I think there is a massive task on our hands, or on the government's hands, to really rebuild that trust, because, and certainly on issues of technology, because we can all imagine or all can recall perhaps data breaches, and certainly surrounding government departments, of laptops being left in places and data being mishandled and certainly not protected. So it's a massive undertaking, but I think as many other entities, institutes, Ida Lovelace Institute particularly, who's looking into AI and data issues, I think they're in their very quick rapid review, evidence review report on this whole issue of track and trace and public health identities. They're identifying, look, we've got to work hard with this trust issue, because it really won't gain traction, and we won't get we won't jump on board with the government if we haven't got that trust. So it is a tough one, and I don't have any easy answers or magic bullets. I think I'd be very surprised and very dubious in my response if people were saying, oh, well, to build up trust, do A, B, and C, and there we've got it. But we've got to, because I think with the examples of other countries around the world of where it goes in the other direction, we can think of China without, I can only think of one, I'll go with China for now, but without singling them out entirely, where even with the issue of CCTV cameras and their use Tiananmen Square, what was used to kind of monitor traffic and for a public good, was then turned on the protesters that were in Tiananmen Square and then broadcast on the TVs to be able to identify them and bring them to justice. So these technologies, we won't go down perhaps on this conversation on whether it's amoral technology, but technologies can be turned against and for the people. And I think trust, therefore, is a key thing that we've got to look at building and rebuilding in these scenarios.
Yeah, and I think what one way of building trust is the government to stop using hyperbole.
Absolutely.
When they said that the track and trace would be world beating,
I think many people's alarms went off on that. I don't think it's going to be world beating.
Yeah, exactly. And those of us, those who felt it intuitively, and those computer scientists who knew it, professionally, knew that was really overstating the case, and then you lose credibility. If you say something is X and it turns out to be a lot less than X, you're going to lose credibility, and everything the government then says afterwards is going to have to be it's going to make their job harder. And I'm not wishing to lay blame to anybody or anything like that, but the government has got to learn to be a little bit more careful about what its promises are. Yeah. It shouldn't be doing this. It shouldn't be exaggerating the benefits when they should be a little bit careful, almost conservative with a small c in how they want the thing delivered or what their expectations are.
I think this is such a good point, because I think the same thing applies to, and Matt, I'd be fascinated in your view on this. And I want us to talk about digital immunity certificates, and we will get there. But this is such an interesting point to do with the government's language and the way that the government presents on this issue of coronavirus. I also wonder whether part of what we're seeing at the moment is quite a strong doubling down on the fears and concerns about a second wave of the coronavirus. And so, Prime Minister says we've seen it in Europe already and we've got to be ready. It could come here, and don't assume that it's not going to happen, that kind of thing. And then all the while, you've got other voices who are saying, just hold on a minute. Is that true? Is that the right approach? We've got this great tension between public health and the economy. If you keep scaring everybody, we're never going to get London filled again, and the economy is just going to tank, and that'll cause greater excess deaths further down the line. And I wonder if that is another area where credibility can very easily be undermined, in that for government, I think it's easier for them to, on an issue like this, take a very negative view, because if they come out and say it's all fine, don't worry, everything's going to be, fine, and then it's not, that's worse than if they come out and say, you've got to watch out, you've got to be careful, and then it's actually better than they fear. Do you think that's another challenge for them?
I think so. I think it was Ian earlier on talking about unknown knowns, and the Donald Rumsfeld infamous quote now that I can't refer to, but unknown knowns and known unknowns and unknown unknowns. Just Google it if you don't know what I'm talking about. I think there is, but I do think in government generally, and I can think of different coloured governments, so everything from the coalition through to where we find ourselves now, we're guilty of this. Because I think we probably work with a 5-year time frame. So what will get us into government, what we now need to do in response to having been voted in, and what will then get us re-elected. So we're working with a 5-year time frame, which might seem very kind of lengthy, but it isn't really. In the future, in terms of future and developments and some of these technologies that will have far-reaching consequences, I think we need to be thinking more 10 years. And so we're spanning governments, we're spanning parliaments. So I think acknowledging that and saying, look, we've got to be thinking more long-term sometimes, and switching and being able to pivot, say, like, what's the long-term implications and consequences of this, and what also the short-term, and therefore how that reflects how we communicate and how we kind of set the scene for some of the decisions we're making now in readiness for the mid to the short term. Because I do think, I think there's, what's sort of one of the latest phrases from the Prime Minister was everything back to normality by Christmas. I get it just adds to the catalogue of some of this hyperbole that Ian's highlighting. I don't think that is going to be the case. I think some of the early conversations I've had with you, James, on these podcasts about the future and the new normal, I think we're looking still at about 3 or 4 years for a vaccine to really be developed, tested, approved as being viable. It does what it says on the tin, so to speak, and then getting people out and getting the injections for it. We're in this for the long haul, and I don't think that message is getting out there clear enough. But partly because I think it's because that will kind of scare some people. It might be very unsettling. It might be unsettling for all of us, actually, if we really take that into consideration, that we could be dealing with aspects of life that we're now having to adjust to for 3 or 4 more years. But I think at least let's get it out there and start to set out the parameters of where we think it's going to be. And within that, we can intelligent people working in government, we can articulate that in a way that says, look, at the moment we feel these are the parameters. We are in a place of an unknown territory. These could well change. But at the moment, to be fair to you, in order to build trust, we need to be setting out this is the long-term and mid-term consequences and implications of what we're facing. Ian, do you agree or disagree with me on that?
I do agree. And I think that what you say, the idea that the Prime Minister can say this will be over by Christmas. They said the same thing in 1914.
Well, in fact, I read a news report that was referring just to that very fact. The last time we heard this, it didn't end well.
No, and what happened was for 4 years, that war left everybody stuck in the trenches. And it was just fighting over bits of land. Now, if we take that as a metaphor for a linguistic kind of battle between one side and the other, and the trenches are, we're all in this together because of lockdown, that's the kind of trenches we're in, we can see that there is that description of being over by Christmas, and we knew history tells us we were not, that optimism was completely, destroyed by the time we got to Christmas, I'm sure, for those who were alive at the time in 1914. And nobody knew when it was going to end. So what will happen here? We'll get to Christmas and it's still continuing. And nobody knows with any certainty when COVID is going to be tamed, eradicated, or vaccinated against. Now, there is hope. Viruses do have a way of being dealt with. I mean, we live in a sort of world where there's millions of viruses. Well, I may be exaggerating. I'm not a virologist, but it's amazing how we don't catch everything. Our immune systems are amazing. We don't get the flu every year, thank goodness. So we may have to live with COVID. It may be something that'll take on the place. It'll be like one of those respiratory conditions that come from time to time that we cannot escape from. And we may have to learn to live in a new reality, not a new normality or a new normal. That will be the normal. In the same way that when we get the flu, some of us, we know it's the flu or a heavy cold and we recover. And older people, some people don't. But we don't. We have a relationship with viruses that makes us a little bit, we've got to be careful. We shouldn't be complacent, but we can't let the virus dictate how we live. Sure. Otherwise, we become a slave to the conditions that the virus is imposing. And if we want never mind liberal society, if we just want to live, if the economy has got to survive, if schools have got to continue, if children and young people have got to flourish, as well as family life flourish, we have got to learn to accommodate this virus in a way that the restrictions will allow. We don't lock down with flu. And thank God there hasn't been a flu pandemic since the 1920s. We have got to be mature in how we respond. And I think the government, certainly governments in the West, have got to allow grown-ups, or should we say mature people, to think for themselves and to allow a certain level of acceptance with caring for others. I'm just conscious that maybe we have, this is where Paul in Romans 14 may apply, where we look after our brothers and sisters. where we don't impose our rules on them because we're the strong ones. And maybe that is an application of that part in Romans in chapter 14. And we may have to learn to live that way going forward, for the foreseeable future. And I think maybe this is where Christians could take the lead, where we could demonstrate that we are behaving in a responsible and credible and healthy way in every sense of that word.
It'd be fascinating to see that as part of the church's role as we move forward. How can we demonstrate to people that yes, as you say, we're obedient citizens, but at the same time we're not lived in a grip of fear, because there's a shed load of fear still in our society, and I think it is that sense of, especially nowadays, when and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't want to be twee about this, but on a daily basis at the moment there are people in our country dying of a number of other conditions that are not COVID, but we don't do daily press conferences and we don't do dramatic events to do with that. And yet that's the reality. And at some point, I think, Ian, you're right. At some point, surely we have to move on from this short-term obsession. See, Matt, I think it's not just governments that are short-termist. I think society is short-term. And I think the media are short-term because everything is dictated by a 24-hour news cycle. And that feeds it, right?
And as Ian was speaking, I'm thinking, well, wouldn't it be great to see a whole variety of newspapers carrying the kind of conversation that we've had in the last 2 or 3 minutes? And there's challenges because we mix messages. And well, actually, a good shaping the conversation, hosting a conversation and saying, look, we've got to face up to the reality here, folks. We're getting some good and diverse opinions and perspectives on life in lockdown, what's beyond lockdown, how is this going to affect us, how we should be moving on. That's the kind of conversation that is, I think, not to say difficult to host, perhaps more challenging because it's causing us to pivot. Okay, what's the short term, what's the mid-term, what's the long term? And I think probably we do, as you're saying, James, we probably live very much and we feel comfortable in the short term. What will get me through the next week, the next month, what will get us out of lockdown? And please make it be 3 or 4 weeks time. Think back to when it was all announced in March and we were thinking June or July, in the next 3 months. I'm thinking how long that would be. I think a wider, more embracing conversation, I think, is necessary. The other thing that springs to mind when we're talking about privacy and consent, I know it's something certainly in the field of bioethics, and one that St Mary's and other institutions, I'm sure in the UK, are keen to address more and more, is that very often we view bioethics as a westernized bioethics, and don't necessarily take into consideration how bioethical issues are interpreted and worked out in other parts of the country. So say, for example, on privacy and consent and confidentiality, we've had students studying with us from Africa, either have come over to study with us or have now since moved over and as part of work and study have chosen to study with us. But they smile, sometimes even laugh with astonishment with how much we bang on about privacy and confidentiality in the UK. Because in Africa, they say you couldn't possibly keep it confidential that so-and-so down the road has got a hernia, for example. Everyone would know because that was the approach of community, of the society working together, supporting one another. And actually, we wouldn't want it any other way. We would want people to know those details. Now, of course, you've got to work things out. We all are from different parts of the world. We all have our different default ways of living and working, and we need to respect that diversity. But I think that does sometimes help us in the West, certainly amongst those that were studying with those African students, suddenly, well, yes, what is it that we really cherish and champion about privacy and confidentiality that we need to hold on to? And perhaps what are the other aspects we can afford to let go? Actually, there's something in being vulnerable with one another and having that sense of community that is a supportive mechanism that we want to see more of in our society.
Well, that's a really good point, Matt. The idea that community, in African communities and so on, but community speaks of something that is cohesive, something that is, or if you prefer, self-contained. You often hear the phrase, it takes a village to bring up a child.
Sure.
Maybe that's not true in the West any longer, but the fact is that there is more coherency in some societies, where everybody knows each other, and so on. And even, you still hear people talking about communities in our country where you wouldn't bother to lock the front door even. Whether that's true now, I don't know, but you hear people some generations ago talking about that. But there was that sense of safety, trust, a sense of well-being, other people's cared for you. But with the advent of social media, with the advent of big data, with the advent of all of these platforms and collections and repositories of data, our privacy is no longer just self-contained within community. It is observed, it is scrutinized, it is surveyed by unknown groups, by unknown people.
But is that a case, Ian, of more data being generated, or is it the case of that amount of data perhaps has always been available? It's what we can do in terms of processing it. So it's not necessarily,
that's right.
It's not necessarily that we're gaining more data. We probably are, but the more fundamental question is, it's the fact that we can process it more efficiently is up for the debate, so I won't use that word, but we can process it. We can do with more with that data than we've ever done before, and that's the hot issue.
Yeah, and that is very true. That is exactly I think one of my points. And the reason I in my book on face recognition and its impact on personal images is that I have tried to demonstrate in that book how privacy is no longer just a value, it's a property. Now, that goes back to the 18th century where a number of philosophers tried to demonstrate what privacy was. But we've got to see privacy as a property now, because in the same way that, coming back to in the old data protection terms, alphanumeric data was data, it was property, similar to intellectual property. Well, our data, we have been digitalized and number crunched, if you like, and we have been informatized, to quote Irma de Plague's term. We have been number crunched, so we're no longer, in terms of data, we are no longer people, we are subjects. We're no longer objects, we are subjects. And that's why privacy in the West ought to be seen as a property, not merely a value. And this is where the law in the UK has not provided a framework for such, because it's been said, there hasn't been sufficient legal framework of jurisprudence to establish the privacy property right, shall we say, to coin a phrase. And that's the issue, if our data is property, why isn't our privacy the same? And if companies like Google and Facebook can make money out of it because we're the product, that also confirms to me that our data has value, our privacy has value, and value only is measured by its property terms.
Absolutely, and I think
and so on.
And it highlights a wider issue, I think, that not only affects this conversation, but those concerning AIs, artificial intelligences, and those forms of technology that are deploying AIs. We can very often feel that we are at the mercy of the big multinationals, Googles, Facebooks, and so forth. But actually, they are influential, and what they're doing with our data is quite remarkable. But the fact is, no AI algorithm is as good as the data it has to work with, and who actually is generating much of the data that they need to work with. It's us. And therefore, I think the greater recognition of actually the importance of data and the very fact it's our data, I think if we can raise awareness of that, then we do have a fairly significant contribution to make, and contribution to give into this whole interaction and relationship with the technology companies, that it's our data, I think raising awareness of that, I think, can be the beginnings of that empowerment, that actually, we have a part to play, and we have and have a powerful influence, and can have a powerful influence on things moving forward.
Right. And I just wanted to clarify, because I might have I wanted to just be a little clearer. Our data objectifies us. We are no longer a subject in our own rights. It's our data that matters. Yes. And if our data is all that matters, what's the point of us? There is an AI can basically dehumanize us.
Yeah.
Think of what Hollywood are doing now with the way that CGI works. You can now create avatars, and you can reuse. Will actors one day be made redundant because all you'd have to do is go and create by animation, movement and so on, and use very clever CGI to create an illusion that you're seeing the real person.
Of course, this happened in Rogue One, the Star Wars film, part of the expanded universe, where Governor Moff Tarkin, who was in the original trilogy, was reincarnated, suddenly reappeared, despite the fact the actor who played him had been dead for a good number of years. And the same thing happened with Connie Fisher, I think who played Princess Leia. The younger form of her was then sort of created using an avatar thing, which is absolutely fascinating. This whole question of it dehumanizing us, of data, of our worth and our value being located more in our data than in the simple fact that we're human and made in God's image. Matt, do you recognize and see that threat, that challenge is just going to grow and grow and grow? Because let's face it, data is useful. Data is currency. Data is, it's so important in our society.
Absolutely, and I think Ian may have something more to say on this, certainly in terms of biometrics and tracking and tracing. Obviously is where we kind of our launch point for this conversation. I think data will become even more important, and there is that danger that it becomes more important than us, than our kind of the human side of things, that we are dehumanized as part of that process. And I think there were interesting similarities, perhaps, with earlier, not necessarily out of date conversations, but earlier conversations in bioethics around cloning and duplications and things like that. We've kind of almost digitalized that process because we've got hold of genetics, which could be viewed as a form of data. And we can kind of almost, through these new technologies that are coming through, clone and almost create virtual identities, as Ian has said. So almost, as is often the case in this sphere of bioethics and emerging technologies, the same old questions keep arising, but in new ways. So I think there is a fascinating similarity between what we've had discussions concerning cloning in the past, now is actually affecting how data is transforming, up for debate, but transforming our identities.
And a fascinating reminder as well, I guess, of how conversations that have happened in the past and lessons learned or not learned from the past can actually be really helpful in terms of shaping what the future is going to look like, which is, as a history student, it's something I'm always keen to bang the drum about, that the study of history is not some stale, boring, dull topic, but actually incredibly important, because yes, times have changed, communities have changed, society has changed, but the fundamental realities of being human and human nature don't change whatsoever. They just relocate themselves and so on.
Absolutely, and it touched a little bit about. I just finished writing a chapter for a book on this. So I will refrain from going into great details, but the philosopher Martin Heidegger, kind of key concern was that we view everything and frame everything, that we see everything as standing reserve, effectively raw materials, and technology is a way in which we can view everything as a raw material that we can manipulate, we can process, and we just think it's just another form that we can work upon. And actually, he was wanting to encourage us to view humanity in context, that technology can be a part of that context, but actually it's so much more than just seeing each other as something that we can kind of work on, that we can kind of utilize in some kind of process in order to get to a end result.
Just coming back, as we draw this to a close, I do want to just touch on these digital immunity passports, which I know we mentioned before we started recording the podcast, and you and I, Matt, have spoken about it previously as well. One of the realities with track and trace is that this is supposed to allow for these. By the way, everyone, I am reading from Matt's very helpful notes that he sent me, so this is not my own knowledge at all. Which also gives me a get-out clause if any of this is wrong as well. This is Matt James's notes.
It's all back on me, right?
That's
okay,
right, all
James,
back on
right.
you, Matt. Yeah, that's how
This wasn't in the contract, but there we go.
Not? Oh, is it not? Oh, well, yeah. I suppose that's what happens when you're a consultant. There are loopholes that we can exploit. So rather than lock down the whole population, the idea is contact tracing allows for the selective isolation of confirmed cases and those thought to have been either infected or at risk of being infected. But you've got big challenges with this, because it's actually very difficult to kind of work out a radius of people who would have been in your vicinity, particularly if you're having a drink at the pub and so on and so forth. And can technology help with the process of contact and trace? And you've identified three possible systems. One is symptom tracking applications. Another is digital contact tracing applications, the much heralded app that was supposed to be launched from the NHS, and we've not really heard much about that in recent months, have we? And then finally, this idea of digital immunity certificates. And so this could stream society based on an individual's health or risk of COVID-19 infection or transmission. And it could allow for some citizens to do more and then for others to do less, in effect. And you've concluded by saying that some countries like New Zealand have chosen not to go down the tech route, everything's done manually, but that in the UK, the NHS app looks to be an expensive failure. And then actually digital immunity certificate could be the way that we move this thing forward. So are you saying that in the UK, out of all of the different technologies that could be used, you think that digital immunity certificates, a digital immunity passport, if you will, could be the one that the UK chooses to pursue?
I think so. Given the context of our conversation thus far, I think it's going to be an equally hard sell, given how well the NHS app a track and trace app has not particularly performed well. They can breeze in again and say the digital immunity passport is the next best thing. I don't think there's going to be much and a healthy buy-in from that. So given that context, I think an awful lot still of work has got to take place. But I do think, even though, admittedly, the World Health Organization is strongly urging governments not to pursue either a physical or digital form of certification, something like this looks likely to be a way of allowing people to move, certainly in terms of cross-border travel, in a way that will be in a monitored way, in an effective way, to be able to allow people to get from A to B and to have some degree of certainty, I use that inverted commas, to know whether they would be allowed to, say, access public transport or other services. So forms of this, I think, could well work in a way that track and tracing apps, proximity apps, may not. But I think in all of this, we've got to realise, and one of the big things that is going to happen is being able to discern what actually is happening in terms of the technology for a COVID pandemic, and what are simply tools and techniques that are quickly being retooled and rebranded by companies to saying, look, this will really help us sort it out. Because I think some things are out there that have been tested but have not really been tested with a pandemic in mind. And so the public health agenda, we come back to communication, we come back to trust. The public health agenda really has got to be the driving force for these technologies to evolve, as opposed to, we've got this technology, surely this is going to help us with COVID, so let's pursue that. We need kind of a little bit of a joined up thinking about, actually it's a public health crisis, therefore let the technology evolve from that.
Ian, do you have any concerns about this digital immunity certificate, this digital immunity passport idea?
Well, I think the if it's something that you're going to have on your phone and you're not carrying your phone, or you don't have a phone, how's it going to work? Not every, I don't know what the uptake of numbers are for phones, but let's assume for a minute that, as we know, that you get certain age groups are more prone to the severity of COVID. And though as we go up in age, it was 70, it might be 60, it could be whatever it is. I don't know how many 60 to 80-year-olds, shall we say, have a mobile phone, especially one of the smart ones that would be capable of holding some kind of chip, kind of an app on it that would say that you've got this certificate. So what are we going to do? Are you going to wear a bracelet with a tag on it? Or are you going to have, what would be the technology that would demonstrate wherever you are that you have this immunity certificate? I mean, if we take the idea that if to go to certain parts of the world, you might need a yellow fever vaccination, where you get a certificate, you take that with you, and you're only allowed to enter the country with that if you've got an up-to-date certificate. They check it at immigration. So are we to say then, if you don't have a digital certificate, you'll have a paper one, and wherever you go into a social situation like a shop, a church, a place of worship, your barber or hairdresser, you take your certificate to say that you've got this immunity, either by a vaccination, or because you've got antibodies. How's it going to work where technology isn't available to people because they haven't got the means? These are the sorts of things that we need to overcome. And it wouldn't go beyond anybody's thinking to think that some of the computer scientists are probably thinking, well, we put devices in dogs. Why can't we carry a chip in our wrist? So in a way, we're back to this whole scenario of what freedoms are we going to give up to remain free?
Yeah.
And I think that this is where the debate could be heading. What freedoms do we have to give up in order to be free? We talk about freedom of expression. We talk about freedom of movement. In the West, those are arguably inalienable rights. But we are moving towards a society that means that our freedom is restricted by way of movement. Our freedom of expression can continue because, well, there'll be platforms for doing so, hopefully. But if it's about freedom to move around, but our freedom to consent to the process that we may or may not agree with, where are we heading with this, and how would this digital certificate work? Given for it to work well, it's got to be taken up by an awful lot of people.
Absolutely. No, I agree entirely with what Ian was saying there. And not only in terms of the technology side of things, but we've also got to realise that immunity testing, I think, in some degree, is going to be a key part of the strategy of the exit strategy. I think it's been referred to as us moving out of a pandemic. But actually, it's the accuracy of the form of testing that I think we also need to be careful of. There's agreement around and amongst the scientific community that antibodies do exist in some form, but there's no agreement as to the parameters. So the time constraints of immunity, for example, is it do we have immunity for 3 months, or is it 3 years? Is it as accurate as we think at the moment? So I agree. I think some form of immunity passport will feature as some part of an exit strategy, I would suggest at this stage. But how well it's designed is also reflected, I think, in not only in the technology, but how effective is immunity based on what we know now, the time constraints involved, and is it an accurate form of testing to begin with? And I think these are all unknowns that we have yet to explore. But I think there is sufficient interest in this area that I think it's certainly this is not going to disappear as quickly as I think track and trace apps will, because I just that's been and gone, I think. But in terms of immunity passports, I think there's progress being made. I think I might have mentioned it earlier, but in Estonia, a private company, I think, TransferWise, is working pro bono on developing passports in this way that are being tested in Estonia to see their effectiveness. They're not wanting to run them out yet until there's some scientific consensus that actually the COVID-19 immunity is something that is viable to track and to trace. So it's not gone public yet, but they're certainly testing, and things are certainly at that stage where this could roll on and develop further if everything comes together.
One of these great topics that we could talk about more and more and more, but we will draw this discussion to a close. And I suppose one thing that did strike me just as you were speaking there, Matt, and Ian as well, throughout this whole conversation, is how difficult this whole business of governing the country in the time of an unprecedented global pandemic actually is. And so, Matt, if I could finish on where you started, or earlier on, where you said one thing that we can do, we should do, we must do, surely, is to pray for our government, pray for those who are making these decisions. And I would encourage you to go further, pray for cabinet ministers, pray for civil servants as well, many of whom will be working on different projects to do with digital immunity certificates and so on, and pray for those working in healthcare, pray for Matt and Ian in their work as well. So what a challenge rests upon our leaders. But this constant tension between individual freedom and the good of the community, I don't think we've managed to fully resolve that tension in this CAREcast, but I hope that we have given you all something to think about. So we'll be continuing with our New Normal series in the coming weeks, and you'll be able to watch this episode on Catch Up, both on YouTube and also on our SoundCloud account, on our website as well. So thank you again so much to Matt. To Ian, thank you for being with me on the CAREcast, and I look forward to being with you again in a few weeks' time.
You've been listening to the CAREcast. Remember to subscribe to get the latest episodes and find out more about the work of CARE on care.org.uk. CARE, for what you believe.